Today, I want to talk about an uncomfortable but important topic: grooming. And no, we ain't talking about haircuts. Child sexual abuse almost never begins with sexual behavior, it begins with building relationships. And that's why grooming is so hard to see. Most people think that grooming is like a creepy stranger pretending to be a teenager online, hiding behind a fake profile, waiting in a digital alley somewhere. And that story exists, but if grooming looked obviously creepy, investigators would have a very easy job and parents would be able to sleep great at night. And I'd probably be out of a job. But research shows that it is not the story most of the time. And honestly, that misunderstanding is one of the reasons why grooming keeps working. So today I want to walk you through what research has actually learned about grooming. Not myths, not headlines, what the data shows when you actually listen to children, you analyze offender behavior, and you study real cases. So what is grooming? Because this word gets used a lot and people often imagine something dramatic or obvious. But research really describes this as a process of preparation that really reshapes relationships, trust, and personal boundaries over time. It's a pattern or series of behaviors used by an offender really to reduce child's resistance, supervision, and to make abuse easier to carry out and harder for the child to disclose. Grooming serves several purposes at the same time. It helps the offender to be able to gain access to the child. It creates an emotional dependence in the offender, both among the child and their family. And it makes the child less likely to tell because the relationship feels meaningful or confusing. And that's why grooming is often misunderstood. It doesn't rely on force at first, it relies on trust. And that's why good people sometimes miss it, because early grooming behaviors can look exactly like what a caring adult does. The difference isn't kindness, the difference is where the relationship is slowly being guided. And once we understand the grooming process, the next step is to understand how research shows that process actually unfolding. So, grooming is not just something offenders do to children. Research actually shows that it happens on three different levels. The offender not only grooms themselves, they groom the environment and the child. First is self grooming, and this is really how offenders justify their behavior to themselves. Because most offenders know that society doesn't approve of what they're doing. So they develop ways to mentally reframe it in their own minds. And so research on offender thinking shows fairly common themes. They convince themselves that the child is so mature for their age, that they're helping or they're educating the child, that they just can't control their urges, or that it's the child's fault, that they were flirting with them. And you'll hear distorted statements like, the child wanted this, or I was protecting them, or this happened to me and I turned out fine, says the person molesting kids. These aren't random excuses. They are psychological shortcuts that reduce guilt and allow the behavior to continue. So, in simple terms, before grooming a child, many offenders have to groom their own conscience because they know it's wrong and they don't want to get caught, but they have to convince themselves somehow, some way, that what they're doing is okay. So while offenders are grooming themselves, they also need to groom the environment. And honestly, this is the part adults miss most often. Offenders work to become trusted, helpful, and at times even indispensable. They volunteer, they help families, they solve problems, they become the coach everyone loves or the adult parents rely on. The goal is simple: create an environment where everyone loves this person so that if a child ever discloses, people are going to be hesitant to believe it. He's such a great guy. He would never do this. The mayor of the town? No, I don't think so. Research shows offenders often look for children who are vulnerable, not just in children, but in the families as well. So, stress, limited supervision, strained relationships, or unmet needs all create opportunities for offenders to slide in and provide the things that the child is missing in their own life. When someone has been consistently kind and helpful, suspicion creates a cognitive dissonance. Our brains really struggle to reconcile this person helps us with this person could hurt my child. And so most people resolve that discomfort by trusting the person, not because they're careless, but because they're human. So when the offender grooms themselves, they groom the environment so that if a child discloses, people are not going to believe the child. The next step is to groom the child, which research shows is a process that often looks like relationship building, or even courtship adapted to a child's age. It almost always starts non sexual. Extra attention, spending time together, making the child feel understood and cared for. And then the boundaries start to slowly shift. Researchers describe both physical and psychological grooming. So, physical grooming, is all about testing boundaries. It involves gradually desensitizing the child to things like touch, starting with things that look normal like hugs, tickling, or playful contact, and then eventually going into showing them pornography or playing chicken. And then the psychological grooming builds emotional dependence at the same time. The offender becomes someone the child wants to be around on a regular basis. Secrecy starts small, rules become flexible, conversations slowly change, and positive experiences become mixed with boundary violations, which creates confusion for children. They may feel cared for and uncomfortable at the same time. But offenders also work hard to prevent disclosure through secrecy, guilting the child, giving them rewards, and if necessary, threatening them. Now, imagine that request coming from someone that they depend on emotionally. Over time, many children come to believe that the situation is their fault or that telling would actually hurt the people that they love, including the offender. And that silence is often the final goal of grooming. So, grooming really isn't one suspicious moment. It's a process that prepares the offender, the environment, and the child long before abuse even becomes visible. So, to better understand grooming, Georgia Winters and colleagues tested what they call a sexual grooming model. And so, to develop this model, they called a number of experts with extensive experience with child sexual abuse cases, such as forensic interviewers, counselors, investigators, researchers, clinicians. They gave them a number of case narratives and asked them to categorize tactics and rate how strongly each reflected grooming to see whether grooming tactics clustered into predictable stages. Spoiler alert, they absolutely did. Their validation study showed grooming typically involved a number of steps, and it generally starts with targeting vulnerable children. And this can sound uncomfortable, but it's the reality of offenders trying to avoid becoming caught. Offenders are typically trying to avoid accountability and detection, so they look for children that they believe are easy to manipulate and will be less likely to be believed. Studies on grooming consistently show selection is often based on a mix of situational, emotional, and developmental vulnerability, not randomness. And so this could mean looking for kids who appear socially isolated, don't really have a lot of support or friends. They struggle with self esteem. They're a latchkey kid. Maybe they don't have a lot of adult supervision, and they may have low self esteem in ways that they're looking for attention or just wanting to feel cared for or belong. And family circumstances also matter. Offenders may notice homes where caregivers are always gone. The mom seems completely overwhelmed. Dad's dealing with mental health issues, or maybe the family has substance abuse issues. And sometimes it's simply just the opportunity. A child who spends more unsupervised time in an environment the offender already has access to, such as schools or playgrounds, Boy Scouts, religious activities. This doesn't mean anything is wrong with the child or the family. It just means that offenders are skilled at identifying where accountability is the lowest and access is going to be easy to gain without detection. So once they identify a vulnerable target, the next is to gain access to the target. And so this is where offenders are going to create opportunities to be around children in the first place. So they may go through school and get the credentials to become a youth counselor. They may volunteer in youth organizations. They may coach sports, help families, or place themselves in roles that naturally provide contact with kids. Once access is established, the goal shifts to isolating the child. So that may look like, oh, I can give him a ride home, or you're always busy. Why don't you let the kids come over to my house? I'll babysit them. Or one of the activities that slowly separate the child from peers or protective adults, like hiking. Isolation rarely happens all at once. It's a gradual process, and it grows until private time with the adult or child feels normal. So not only do they need to gain access to the child, they need to do that by gaining trust of the child, but also their caregivers. So offenders are going to work to gain the trust of both the child and everyone that is around them. These are the types of offenders that often appear like likable, helpful, and someone that you can depend on. Over time, they earn an insider status in the family or within the community. And with a child, they may provide special attention, gifts, privileges, emotional support, and other things that make the child feel special or understood. And with older youth, this can include introducing alcohol or drugs as a way to bond and lower boundaries. And so the relationship begins to feel important, sometimes even necessary, and for some of the youth, exciting, in something different. Once offenders have identified vulnerable targets and they've gained access and started to groom the family and the environment, this is where the boundaries start to shift. And so the offender may start to introduce sexual topics through jokes or conversations, maybe show them pornography, maybe accidentally barge in on them. And physical contact often starts completely non sexual and gradually escalates, such as tickling to roughhousing. Researchers sometimes describe this as moving from mild to wild, and each step makes the next step feel less unusual. So the goal is to normalize behavior that would have once felt clearly inappropriate. The long term goal is secrecy and control. Once abuse actually occurs, offenders are solely focused on preventing disclosure and maintaining access. They do this by convincing the child that the behavior is normal. They're trying to minimize the harm or make the child feel responsible. A lot of that boundary testing is getting dirt on the kid that they can use as an adult to get the kid in trouble. And so they will extort them to continue it. They'll use things like affection, reward, guilt trips, and at times they will coerce or threaten them to the point that many children are left feeling confused, loyal, and ashamed, which makes disclosure incredibly difficult. Let me give you an example that explains how grooming can work in real life. So imagine you have a mom and a dad, and they have two younger boys. Dad has a longtime friend who also lives nearby. He knows the family for years. Everyone trusts him. He's not a stranger, and he's part of the family's social circle. One afternoon, mom needs to run an errand, but dad's at work. So he lets the boys hang out at the friend's apartment for a little while. Nothing unusual. This guy has watched them before. So mom drops them off at the apartment. The boys walk in and they notice a video game that they've always wanted to play, but aren't allowed to play it or have the game at home because mom and dad think it's too violent. They get excited only to be let down when they tell the perpetrator, oh, we're not allowed to play that game. Now, the offender picks up on that and is saying, oh, well, you know what? It's actually my fault that I left it out. So I probably shouldn't, but since it's my fault, like I'll let y'all play it this time. But then he adds a condition. Let's just keep this between us so I don't get in trouble. And that moment is not about the video game. It's a test because he wants to see who's going to tell. Are they going to keep a small secret? Are they going to accept breaking a rule together? Will they protect the offender? This is a low stakes test because if the boys tell their mom, the consequence is going to be minor. Maybe she calls and says, hey, don't let them play the violent video game. Then the offender learns, oh, I need to slow down or build more trust or find out who said what and target the one that didn't say anything. But if they don't tell, then the offender learns something important. These children are willing to share secrets with him. So the next boundary push becomes easier. Maybe extra privileges, maybe staying later, maybe more private time. Each step feels small on its own, but together they build a pattern where rule breaking and secrecy become normal. So by the time abuse occurs in many cases, the child isn't facing one secret, they're carrying several. And offenders use that history as leverage. The child may think, I'm going to get in trouble too, or my parents are going to be so mad, or this is partly my fault. And when secrecy stops working, offenders may escalate to guilt, manipulation, or threatening the kid to keep silent. And while we're able to learn about grooming patterns from offenders, child victims say the same thing. So, for example, Katz and Barnett's reviewed and coded a random sample of 95 transcripts of forensic interviews of children in cases where substantiated child sexual abuse occurred among children ages 5 to 13. So in these interviews, before the abuse, children often described offenders as unusually caring or attentive. Like one child said, he told me he loved to stay up with me and watch TV. He asked about my day at school and walked me home. Another child said, he was so caring. He cared more than my friends, even more than my parents. Nothing about that sounds dangerous on its own. That's exactly why it works. Grooming often begins with attention that feels supportive and safe. Additionally, offenders weren't just building relationships with children, they were building credibility with the adults. In fact, one child said how the offender always came and helped my mom with me and my siblings so she could rest. And then another explained that their parent actually trusted the offender because mom would say she felt safer when the offender was there helping. So access wasn't always forced, it was granted through trust. And once trust was gained, boundaries were tested. Children describe gifts and privileges tied to these private moments. For example, he gave me earrings and then he took me into his room and closed the door. Or he bought me jeans like my friends and gave them to me as a present. So you'll notice how kindness and rule breaking become linked together. That's a classic grooming transition. So after the abuse, the focus really shifted from keeping the child from telling. Children describe offenders minimizing what happened or framing secrecy as protection. In fact, one child remembered being told, "You know what, I'll buy you if you won't tell." And another described threats. He said, "If I told anyone, he would hurt my little sister." And then others were made to feel responsible. This stage is what researchers call maintenance. The offender works to make the behavior feel normal, shared, and dangerous to disclose. And what these interviews show is that grooming doesn't feel like grooming while it's happening. And to many children, it feels like a relationship slowly changing until they realize that they no longer have control. And now we got to talk about the internet and technology because a large scoping review compared grooming tactics before and after the internet and found that offenders didn't just get more clever. The internet and technology basically just made it easier for offenders to communicate with children and youth because technology allows constant communication, private access to targets anywhere in the world, and disconnect and anonymity from technology also allows for offenders to quickly develop emotional intimacy with the target, which then leads to secrecy and exploitation. Research analyzing real online grooming strategies found early interactions were overwhelmingly just like pre internet behaviors. They were very supportive and relational, not entirely focused on sex, which means parents waiting for explicit text messages are often watching the wrong stage of the process. So, who are these online predators? A meta analysis examining online crimes against children found something that challenges popular belief. Chris Hansen and his To Catch a Predator Dateline series lied to us because, in reality, most online predators are not strangers lying about their name, saying that they are Becky, they're 14 years old, and they also love Taylor Swift. The research shows about two-thirds of offenders were known to victims in some way. And a significant portion of the online offenders were juveniles themselves. So grooming online often mirrors offline grooming. It grows inside relationships and it's not random stranger attacks. So the question remains, how are we able to determine whether someone is grooming a child versus acting as a generally supportive adult? And this can be hard. We've learned from the stranger danger era, and we absolutely do not want to teach kids that every coach, teacher, or mentor is suspicious and a potential predator. Parents and investigators also shouldn't have to constantly think worst case scenario about every adult that a child interacts with. Parents and guardians should really be focusing on boundary patterns, not necessarily personality traits. Adults who are trying to be helpful are going to communicate and seek accountability. Grooming adults are going to try to keep everything private. So, some healthy adult behaviors, the communication is always visible with the parents, or parents are always kept in touch on what is going on. The boundaries stay consistent, the rules applied to all children that they're interacting with, and independence is encouraged. Whereas grooming behaviors is all about special exceptions, increasing secrecy, isolating one child, making them become emotionally dependent, and positioning themselves as the only one who really understands this child. And so, a simple test that investigators can use is, does the adult move closer to supervision or further away from it over time? And if it's the latter, we need to be looking into some grooming behaviors. So instead of saying, don't talk to strangers, we need to be teaching kids that they should never be having secrets with adults. Safe adults don't ask children to manage their own feelings. Attention should never feel like pressure. Children should never be made to feel guilty or bad for something that they do not want to do. And maybe most importantly, if a child tells you something uncomfortable, your first reaction should not be panic. It should be curiosity and appreciation for them telling you. We also want to convey to kids that we are safe and supportive adults who children and youth can come to in times of need. And so if we freak out, that's what the kid's going to remember, and they are not going to further disclose if they think that we are going to continue to freak out. Kids keep talking to adults who stay calm. So in sum, here's the uncomfortable truth. Grooming works because it looks normal while it's happening. But research gives us something powerful: patterns. Once you understand the process, you stop looking for villains and then you start noticing patterns and trajectories. And that doesn't make us paranoid. It makes us informed. And informed adults are really one of the strongest protective factors children have.